It is my great honor to introduce a trailblazing justice, a fierce advocate for justice, and a powerful voice for equity in the legal system, Justice Montoya-Lewis. Justice Montoya-Lewis is the first Native American to serve on our highest court. She brings a wealth of experience shaped by her deep commitment to justice, her heritage as a citizen of Pueblo of Isleta and a descendant of the Pueblo of Laguna, and her decades of service in tribal, state, and federal courts. Prior to her service on our court, she also served as a Superior Court judge and a chief judge for several tribal courts. I can also say that she has brought a profound sense of equity, justice, wisdom, and kindness to the Washington State Supreme Court. Her reading of the Tao Senate order vacating an unjust conviction from the bench of the Supreme Court was a high point of our time, my time, serving as a law clerk at the court. I'm very pleased to welcome her to this speech. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time out of this beautiful spring day to be inside with me. I was asked by a number of people after I had described this talk if I would be willing to give the talk to people from AOC and the Supreme Court, and so here we are. And I look forward to sharing with you some of my history and the way in which the federal government's policies towards Native people has impacted my own family, as well as, of course, thousands, if not millions of families throughout the history of this country. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some of the policies that I'll note as I go through the presentation. And I'm going to start with a slide that may sort of surprise you if you haven't studied Indian law yet, or at any point. The reason I use the title, The Indian Problem, is that this was the language used by the federal government and many state governments whenever they talked about what to do about the reality of that there were indigenous people on land that in the settlers' view had never been utilized in any way. So anytime settlers wanted to move west, they had the Indian problem. What are we going to do about these people who are here? And so these are a number of different policies that the federal government used in order to try to address the Indian problem. That language is language that you can see being used up through the 1980s in official documents. Starts very early on in the 1750s or so, where you start to see this language called the Indian problem, and it follows right up really through my own time in high school. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about each of these. So the Allotment Act and the Indian Removal Act are two approaches used by the federal government to try to address this issue. And effectively what they did was they said, if we can get Native people to be like us, to be homeowners, to homestead land, to use the land in the way that we imagine land should be used, then there will no longer be living in communal ways. The Indian Removal Act is exactly what it sounds like. Starting from the East Coast, the federal government started moving Native communities west. Many of them were moved to what they call the Indian Territory and what we now call Oklahoma, and then continued to push those indigenous communities further west as the country itself moved further west. As you might imagine, that policy, the Allotment Act and the Removal Act, failed to change the indigenous communities into homesteaders, and created numerous other problems and very soon after the Allotment Act, Congress started looking for other ways to try to address the Indian problem. They moved towards a policy of assimilation. So in today's world, when we talk about people of color becoming assimilated into the mainstream culture and community, it's really seen as sort of as a dirty word. Assimilation in these in the documents that you can see historically is seen as the goal. We want to get these Native folks to no longer be tied to their communities, tied to their languages, tied to their religious practices. And that process began in the 1800s, and that's when the late 1800s, and that's when you begin to see institutional boarding schools and other ways of removing children from their parents in a way, an attempt to separate them from their communities and languages. Again, it wasn't a success in the way that the federal government had hoped. And that brought the government and the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it wasn't called that at the time, it had a slightly different name, a man named John Collier, to create the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And basically what that act said was, we are going to treat the people who have some form of tribal government, which was effectively all of the tribes, and allow them to have tribal governments, to have sovereignty over some things, not complete sovereignty. They use this language called quasi-sovereignty. And in the course of the Indian Reorganization Act, they banned a whole bunch of tribal practices. They banned tribal dancing. They banned tribal religious practices that we would today call giveaways or potlatches. And they said, you can't do any of those things anymore because those are, and this is in the act itself, those are the vestiges of savagery. If you have studied anything about Indian law, you'll recognize the name of Felix Cohen. Felix Cohen wrote the treatise about Indian law. It is still considered to be one of the most important works on Indian law. It's been rewritten several times. And over the course of my career, at least, it's been revised by Indigenous law professors. But I still brace every time I see his name because I understand that when this was drafted, the purpose of the Indian Reorganization Act was really to make Indians and their governments look exactly like state and federal governments. And they did that by saying, you have to have a constitution if you want to continue to receive federal funding that will support healthcare and that will support housing and basically the things that we as a federal government say we have a trust responsibility for. We're gonna sort of stop that unless you create a constitution that creates 3 branches of government and creates some civil rights for tribal citizens against their government. There were a couple things that were left out in the requirements of Indian Reorganization Act constitutions. One of those was that there was no prohibition on the establishment of religion. So tribes that had significant religious governments or governments that were intertwined with religious practices were allowed to continue to do that, but they still had to have separate tribal courts, an executive, which is a tribal council, and some kind, the executive would be what we call in Washington a chairman, what we call in New Mexico a governor, and then a tribal council, which functions as the lawmaking body. Many tribes in this country continue to work under IRA constitutions. My own tribe is one of them. And I think almost every tribe that I've been a judge for has been an IRA constitutional tribe. And what that means is you have to look first, just like you would in any problem, at what the Constitution says. That made tribes easier to work with because it was a structure that the federal government understood. And so that process of allowing tribes to have formalized governments was relatively successful when you compare it to the prior approaches to the Indian problem. But there continued to be, quite frankly, too many Indian people. And then that's when we moved into what's called the termination era in the 1950s and 60s. And again, it's exactly like what it sounds like. The federal government recognizes tribes, and so I'm sure many of you have heard the term a federally recognized tribe, and there's a list of about 550, maybe it's 570 now, federally recognized tribes. You can go on the Department of the Interior website and see them. The Congress has what we call plenary power over tribes, which means they have absolute power over tribes. And so in this era, they decided tribe X, I'll give you an example, Washington example, the Nooksack tribe. You are small. You seem to speak more than one language, so it doesn't look like you're a single body of people, and you don't really have a land base. So you are no longer federally recognized. And what that means is, from the viewpoint of the federal and state governments, you are no longer a tribe, and the people you consider your citizens are no longer citizens. It's just a complete stripping of there being any sovereignty at all for these bodies. And you know, a lot of us, when I first heard that in law school, I thought, well, that can't possibly be right. It has happened to hundreds of tribes. And I will tell you that I recently went to a conference where there were a lot of lawyers who practice Indian law, and all of them said, our biggest concern is that the current administration will simply not recognize tribes at all anymore and strip federal recognition from all of them. And that's a very real possibility. It really takes a vote and a signature. In the 1970s, so this is President Nixon, we moved into an era that we are still in called the self-determination era. Effectively, what Nixon and others decided at this point was, we're going to let tribes be tribes, and to the extent that they have jurisdiction over their lands and people, will allow them to continue to have that jurisdiction. The Supreme Court still makes decisions about how much jurisdiction tribes have and what that looks like. And you know, I could spend the next 10 weeks talking about the complexities of the jurisdictional problems all of this has created. And some tribes that were terminated, like the Nooksack tribe in the 1970s, were reinstated. Some of you may be familiar with the ongoing issues related to the disenrollment by the Nooksack Tribal Council of about a third of its people. Much of that comes out of the termination that happened to that tribe in the 1960s. It's sort of a creation of a problem created by the federal government. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about my family and how those different eras impacted us. So at this point, I'll pace. I'm better at pacing than standing still. So I'm going to start by introducing you to my great-great-grandmother, Sachna. She is from the Pueblo of Laguna, born in 1839. One of the things that is sort of I'm never quite sure what the word is to use, a bonus perhaps, a lucky piece of being a Native person, is that because of all of those, the various policies toward Native people, we were counted constantly. So you can go back in the National Archives all over the country and find pictures, census or ledger books, where they are counting the number of people who are living in Laguna, or the Pueblo of Isleta, or the Chehalis tribe. And so what you will see if you go, the further back you go, you'll see phonetic spellings of their Indian name because they didn't have Spanish or English names at that point in the early 1800s. And so, you know, you start to be able to find photographs. So my husband, Colin, who's here today, did much of this research to find these photographs. If you are Native, you can find all kinds of information about your family, because what the government was doing was not just creating a census, but making sure that the numbers were going down. And so all of those policies, basically they were testing to see if, did it work? In New Mexico, the Pueblos and many of the Navajo people who lived in New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah were covered by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's a treaty between Mexico and the tribes. And the U.S., when they took the part of New Mexico from Mexico that is it's now part of the United States, they said, this is a formal treaty. We recognize treaties. That's what our Constitution says we have to do. And in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it guaranteed that Pueblo people were not to be moved. So when I go home to my Pueblo at Isleta and I walk into the church that's there, or houses that surround the square where dancing happens during feast days, I'm walking into houses that have been inhabited since time immemorial. You hear that language a lot when you hear about fishing up here. We use that language when we talk about the ties to the land that we have, because we have been there and been there for millennia. And so to a certain extent, that's again, another sort of benefit, because you can pretty well rely on the census data that you find. And again, there are lots of pictures, lots of documentation of who these people were that were living in the Pueblos. So Sachima was married, you can go to the next slide, Aaron, to Jose Pizano. I see my father's serious face in this picture, so every time it's big, I kind of like, I'm in trouble. So this was a photograph taken of him at Laguna. It's hard to see it, but at the bottom it says his name. It says Laguna. It gives you the name of the photographer. He was born in 1832 and lived until 1923, and they had 10 children. So they were living in Laguna, which, if you know anything about New Mexico, is about 25 miles west of Albuquerque. And if you go about 20 minutes southwest of Albuquerque, you will run into Isleta. Isleta and Laguna are pretty close as the crow flies. And there were people whose job it was to communicate what's happening at Laguna to what's happening at Isleta, and they would run back and forth. And this is true of pueblos throughout New Mexico. There are running trails, some of which, because they predated statehood, have easements so that ranchers have to allow access for runners to continue to run through those areas. So you can go to the next slide. So if you go back in your mind to the various periods of federal policy, one of those periods was the period of assimilation. And as you recall, that's where I said that is the beginning of institutional boarding schools. This is one of them. There were many in the United States that were run by the federal government. Carlisle Boarding School was in Pennsylvania. These buildings still exist. It doesn't exist as Carlisle Boarding School anymore. It exists as the U.S. Army War College. And prior to it becoming Carlisle, it was a place where soldiers were trained. So it was really the format of this boarding school was a military format. And the person who ran it was named Colonel Pratt. He founded Carlisle, and he developed this model of how to kill the Indian but save the man. So those of us that kind of hear that in today's world, I'm sure flinch at that, but that was the motto that he repeated over and over again, not just to the federal government, to the people who donated money to make this run, but also to the kids themselves. This is just a random class picture. There are more of these if you are interested in looking at them. But what I look at when I see this photograph, the first thing that jumps out at me is the short hair. One of the first things that happened when people got to Carlisle is that their hair was cut. Not all tribes in the U.S. and North America have beliefs about the importance of hair, but many of them do, and my tribe certainly does. So just sort of seeing that image and just that one piece of it that jumps out at me, causes me to sort of feel this physical pain, in addition to many other things we could talk about just in looking at this photograph. So we can go to the next page. So this is a photograph that was taken when when a group of kids, these kids are from Laguna, came to Carlisle boarding school in 1880. So, you may be wondering, how did they get there? The answer is that Indian agents, that's what they were called, would go to a tribe and sweep up all of the kids, anybody under the age of 18. So sometimes they were 5, sometimes they were 17, and take them to the train station and put them on a train to Pennsylvania. Without the consent of the parents, sometimes without the knowledge of the parents or the tribal government, they would just come in and do it, and certainly without the consent of the children. So most of these kids, at least at the beginning, had no idea where they were going and what was happening. They were just on a train, and I can't imagine what that would feel like. This photograph is probably taken a couple of days after they've been there because they're not wearing traditional or the clothing that they came in with, and I'll show you why I think that in a second. But in looking at this photograph, I could be wrong about this, but I believe the woman second from second from the right, the one standing with a bow tie, I should never talk about directions when I have a microphone, is my great-grandmother, Mary Perry, so one of the children of Jose and Sachima. And the two boys that are sort of kneeling down, I believe, are going to be, you'll see in another picture. But they are, the picture's a little bit fuzzy, so it's hard to be certain. But this is, again, one of the many photographs that people at Carlisle took to document the before, right? This is how these people, these kids came in, and then they documented later when they graduated the after. And I'll get to that in a moment. So you can go to the next slide. So at the top here that is Mary Perry. That's my great grandmother. She was in Carlisle boarding school from 1880 to 1884, 86. There's a couple of conflicting documents. It's a little bit hard to tell. But in this photograph, she is with two other people who are from her pueblo. They're not brothers, but they're cousins. And one time when I was giving this talk at the end, I was in Tacoma. Someone came up to me and said, "Go back to that picture. That person is my relative," which I thought was really unlikely and an amazing coincidence. So this is a before picture. If I were to show you the picture on the day that I got married, I was wearing something very similar to what she is wearing. So you can see that she is wearing a woven clan belt, very similar to what I'm wearing. That clan belt is woven to give you information. So the colors will tell people who look at it what clan you belong to. Sometimes it gives you additional information just by virtue of not just the colors, but the weave itself. And then under that, she's wearing what is called a manta, which is made of wool. It's like thick black wool. Those of you who have ever been to New Mexico may be thinking, why would they be wearing thick black wool in New Mexico when it's 100 degrees in the summer? And I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you it's a bad idea. I did it in June when I got married, and I thought it was going to just melt. Typically she would be wearing moccasins that are thigh high, that start at the bottom, made of deer leather. She's wearing sort of Western shoes in this picture, but that's a more typical look. I also noticed that she's not wearing any jewelry, and I would be very surprised if she didn't have jewelry when she left Laguna, and I imagine it was probably taken and pawned or sold. Okay, go to the next slide. Did we skip one? Yeah. Oh, no, you can go back. Sorry, Adrian, thank you. So this is an example, I'm not expecting you to read it, don't worry, of a newsletter that went out, and they started the day Carlisle opened. It was called something else and eventually morphed into being called the Indian Helper. This is a newsletter that went out to donors. It went out to Congress people. It was sort of widely circulated to tell the stories of what was happening at Carlisle. And there are hundreds of these. It's kind of amazing when you see the amount of documentation that occurred at Carlisle. It's sort of endless. So you can look at any of these and find little stories about math class or what the girls were doing. I'm just going to ask you to go to the next slide now. This is a quote from Colonel Pratt, and I just want to highlight it because of his emphasis on the importance of education. So this is not from one of the newsletters. This is from a speech he gave. And he said, just as long as the Indians are ignorant, they will have to do what people with knowledge and power tell them to do, no matter whether the demands are unjust. The Indians can't help themselves. They may try to help themselves by fighting, but Indian fighting never lasts long. How are you going to get out of this trouble? Education, education, education. As long as all Indian children are kept in all Indian schools with all Indian surroundings, they will remain all Indian. So this was the viewpoint, not just from Pratt, but the viewpoint that was communicated to the children. The value in being at one of these boarding schools is that you get an education. The value at being at one of these boarding schools is that you no longer are surrounded just by your community. You are in a school where you are learning English and speaking English. And you are also practicing a Christian faith. There were different Christian faiths at different boarding schools, but Christian faith was an important tenet of all of these boarding schools. And if you look to what was happening to First Nations in Canada, you'll see that there were also this very similar story of boarding schools. Almost all the boarding schools in Canada were run by churches, and there were as many federal boarding schools as there were mission-based church boarding schools in the United States, many of them on the West Coast. And they all had the same dogma of how you, of what was happening in these schools. So you can go to the next one. There's a couple of other quotes just to sort of top that off. He said, "It's a great mistake to think that the Indian is born an inevitable savage. He's born a blank, like all of the rest of us. Left in the surroundings of savagery, he grows to possess a savage language, superstition, and life. When we allow him the freedom of association and the developing influences of social contact, then the Indian will quickly demonstrate that he can be truly civilized, and he himself will solve the question of what to do with the Indian." So what he's describing there is the process of assimilation and the process of education. And what he's describing throughout this, if you just go back to the hair for a second, is a violent process. It's a process of ripping children from their families without the family's consent, without the families knowing where they were going. And this happened throughout the country. And then being assaulted when they spoke their language. And that was a very common way of disciplining someone, a child who was speaking their indigenous language. They would be beaten, and it would happen every time they spoke their language. So being at these boarding schools was really tough. And when you look at the Indian helper, it really talks about it like it's summer camp. It really describes, they'll sort of highlight a particular student of the month and talk about the things that the student did and learned. But even in the newsletter itself, it describes the process of solving the question of what to do with the Indian. Many of the Indian children that went to these boarding schools were then adopted out into white families, often as housekeepers for the girls. Many of the boys were sent on to military college or military service. Some of them went home. And there are incredible stories of kids who just ran away from these boarding schools and somehow made it back home. There's an incredible story of a kid leaving Carlisle, just left Carlisle and showed up back at home in North Dakota, so Pennsylvania to North Dakota. And there's more than one of those stories. We took a trip out to the Olympics over this last weekend, and I walked into the forest and was instantly lost. So I just cannot imagine being a 13-year-old and figuring out how I go from Pennsylvania to get back home in North Dakota without any support, help, or anything. Those stories are just incredible. So as I said, lots of these kids were adopted out. If you look at the Indian Helper on the back, there are ads that advertise children for sale. And then many of them went directly into military service. You can go to the next slide. Oh, that's not the right slide. Can you go back one? Huh. That's it. Yeah, thank you. So not everybody survived this experience. So if you recall, my great-great-grandparents had 10 children. This is May Paisano. She was sent to Carlisle boarding school. I don't have her date of birth, and I don't know how old she is here, but she was there for 6 years. This is an after picture. She is one of Mary Perry's sisters. It's not very clear what happened to her. I was looking at the records last night. It sounds like she had maybe the flu. She was running a fever, and then just didn't wake up the next day. There are all kinds of stories of this, and I was listening to someone recently talk about Carlisle boarding school and her visit there, and she said, she had gone to do some research, and part of that research was to go to through the records into the cemetery, and it just sort of struck her that she had never been to a school that had a cemetery before, and she said, if you're at a school that has a cemetery, you've got a problem. So you can go back one. Abraham, thank you. So this is the after picture taken of Mary Perry, either in 1884 or 1886. So you can see that they're older. All three of these young people are now adults. The men are wearing military uniforms, short hair. Remember that haircut? I'm going to come back to it. And Mary Perry is wearing Western style clothing. She went back to Laguna and married William Paisano and lived into the 1950s. So there are, it's kind of remarkable, there are the stories of their children as well. But what you start to see when you get to this generation who were sent away, then the question becomes, well, what happens to their kids when it's time for them to go to school? So I think you can go 2 slides forward. Oh, this is a photograph that I just found yesterday. There's constantly stuff being uploaded. I had never seen this before. The person who uploaded it to the university website where the archive is held said that they believe that this is 7 of the children of Satima and Jose. I'm not sure if that's the case. It's really hard to tell, but I hope over the summer to do some additional research to see if I can pin that down. And that may be trying to find people in New Mexico and at Laguna who would recognize them. But it is entirely possible. But from the records that I could see, almost all, if not all, of those children were sent to boarding schools. And if this is them, then many of them were sent to Carlisle. You can go to the next one. So this is William Paisano. He married Mary Perry. They had 8 children. I really love this photograph because, again, I see my dad in many respects. You can see that he is wearing a flag. One of the things that these schools really taught and valued was the importance of military service. And Native people serve in the military at the highest demographic of any racial or ethnic group. It is a very strong value in Native communities that you serve in the military. I think that comes in part from this history, but it also comes in part from something my dad always used to say when I would sort of do battle with him about the silly sort of things now that I think back on it. But when I was in college, it was sort of this battle of, should we say American Indian or Native American? And he said, I don't understand the term Native American because I'm more American than anybody. So I don't understand why you would add that word, because if I'm going to describe who I am in my tribal language, then I'm that. If I'm going to describe it in English, then I'm American. But there's no reason to say Native. And we did all I don't know, that was a dinner fight that we had multiple times, which upon reflection seems like a waste of time, but whatever. I was young. So this is an older photograph of William Paisano. Same person in the photo from before, but much older. Mary Perry. So the person that we started with going to the boarding school, and then Petra Jojola Montoya and Juan Antonio Montoya. And these are my great-grandparents on the day that my grandparents got married. So this is where you start to see the Pueblo of Isleta come in. A couple of things I'll note is that if you look at the necklaces that they're wearing this similar kind of necklace to what I'm wearing. It's called a squash blossom. And women receive squash blossoms as gifts of honor. Very often you'll see older women who are dressed exactly like this. Here you can see the deer moccasins, just piled with squash blossoms. So this is the day that my grandparents got married. You can go to the next slide. And this is my grandfather. This is Bart Montoya, who was born in Isleta in 1906. He died in my first year of law school in 1993. And to go back to the question that I raised about, well, what happened in terms of school once you moved from the institutional boarding school and the federal government requiring kids to go or abducting them and sending them? Well, the answer in many cases was that the parents took on that role and believed it was to their children's benefit to go to those schools. So my grandfather was sent to Haskell Indian School. Haskell was in the news recently because the current administration cut most of Haskell's funding, and there's a ton of students there. It's now called Haskell Tribal Nations College, and it's run by a tribe. So there are a ton of kids who it's unclear whether they're going to graduate or not. But initially, it was run as an institutional boarding school. And my grandfather was sent there with the consent of his parents because his parents, who also have a boarding school history, really believed in the importance of education, really believed in the importance of going away and becoming a man, and learning the mainstream culture so that you could succeed. I'm always struck by this photograph and the next one, and the clothing that they're wearing. Because when I think about my grandfather, I think about him baling hay in, flannel shirts and working on the farm. And certainly I don't think I really ever saw him wear a tie now that I think about it. So this is a photograph of his graduation, and he was trained as a teacher. So you can go to the next slide, and this is my grandmother. So my grandmother was May Paisano. And so she was named after, she was named after May Paisano, the one who did not survive Carlisle. And although I'm sure I knew that at some point, I had forgotten it until yesterday when I was going through the documents. It just sort of hit me. So again, she was sent by Mary and William to Haskell Indian School, where she met my grandfather. That photograph at the top with her sort of permed hair and string of pearls, again, I never saw her look like that at all. But the bottom picture is how I saw her, on a horse, working the farms, working on the range. They both went to Haskell, and she also was trained as a teacher. So over the course of my family, the generations of my family, we go from, basically people who had limited to no contact with Westerners, white Europeans, to children being taken from those communities and educated into the ways of white Europeans, and then the next generation voluntarily sending those children to these schools. So we can go to the next. This is Albuquerque Indian School. If you go to Albuquerque now, this building doesn't exist, but it existed for until fairly recently. It's now right in the middle of Albuquerque. But I actually took some classes there myself. It was sort of a place where you could go and get tutoring, and then there was all kinds of other sort of governmental, tribal governmental things happening in that building when I was a teenager. But it started as a boarding school that was closer than Haskell, which was in Kansas, or other schools that were in Utah, California, Arizona, or Pennsylvania. So this is just a photograph of the school. Some kids went there as day students, and some went as boarding students. Next slide. This is my father. This is my father's commissioned photograph when he joined the U.S. Air Force. So he went to Albuquerque Indian School as a boarding student. If you drive from where my father lived in Isleta, if you get in your car and you drive to where Albuquerque Indian School was, it's 15 minutes. Feels like it's very close. In those days when he was there, it felt impossibly far. It was just a completely different world. And people who taught there were nuns, and they taught using the Pratt method. After my father went to a small school at Isleta called the Isleta Day School. For a little while, he was there. It's not totally clear, but maybe through all the way through elementary, or maybe just through like 3rd or 4th grade. And then from there, he went to Albuquerque Indian School, and then from there, he went to a Catholic high school. And that's really where, at least in my view, the trauma really began. Because anytime he spoke one of the languages he knew. And at this point, before my father went to high school, he spoke Tiwa and Tewa, which are 2 different languages, the Carison language, English, and a lot of Spanish. He wasn't fluent in Spanish, but he spoke a lot of it. The Carison language is the language that the Laguna people speak. The Tiwa language is the language that the Isleta people speak. They are completely unrelated. I have no idea what the Laguna people are talking about, ever. And I have a very small idea of what the Tiwa people are talking about, but I can usually tell when they're making fun of me. And so, my father was multilingual. He spoke he would say 3, I would say 4 to 5 languages at the time that he went to high school. And anytime he spoke those languages, including Spanish, because his best friend was Mexican American. And in New Mexico at the time of statehood, and all through today, the Constitution says this is a bilingual state. All forms have to be in English and Spanish. There have to be ways for people who speak Spanish to access any governmental office. So it always sort of shocks me shocked me when my dad would tell stories about his best friend getting beaten by the nuns for speaking Spanish, just as he did. But he was also beaten for speaking any of his tribal languages. So when you get to my generation, my father was deeply committed to me having an education. It was, if there was anything, any value that was instilled in me, it was that. You could go back to that quote from Pratt about education, 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 and you could take a snapshot of a family discussion over dinner at my house when I was a kid, and my dad would be saying those words. The only way to a good life is to have an education. And my father got his education post-secondary by going to the Air Force. That was how he paid for school. He's a graduate of the University of New Mexico, and he served a full career as a U.S. officer. We moved around all over the place as part of his career. You can go to the next photograph. This is a photograph. This at the bottom, it says all the Montoyas. That's in my handwriting of my Chi'i, which is my grandmother. So that's May Paisano, Bart Montoya, my mother Barbara, and my father Vince. This photograph was taken in Spain, where my dad was stationed and where he met my Australian Jewish mother, and we do not have time to get into that. So part 2. But they met, and it's a whole thing. Okay, just take my word for it. And I'm in this picture. And I tell that even though my mother, if she were here, would walk up the stairs and slap me solid for telling you. But I'm in there. You can't really see it. You can sort of see. There's a little belly there. So this photograph was taken around February, I think that's right, February in 1968 in Spain. So my father loved being in the Air Force, and we traveled all over the world. Well, that's probably too strong. He did. He spent time in Thailand, Vietnam, Spain, England, so forth. And so he also wanted, even though we weren't living on the reservation, he also really wanted me to speak the language, at least the Tiwa language that's the Isleta language. And so, it's hard to do that when you're not surrounded and just, hearing that language every day, particularly when there's no analog. So, if you speak French, learning Spanish is easier. That doesn't really work when you are an English speaker and are trying to learn an indigenous language from New Mexico from one person. But something else would happen when my father would try to teach me how to count in the Tiwa language, or would just speak to me in the Tiwa language. Those lessons would last maybe 10 minutes before he would stop. And when I say I recognize that look from William Paisano, that's the look I think of. So much going on behind his eyes that he would never tell me. He never explained it. He just stopped. And sometimes he would cry, and sometimes he would just leave the room. I always thought I had done something wrong. I pronounced something incorrectly. I forgot the prior lesson. It wasn't until I started to dig into his past as an adult, and really after his death, that I realized that speaking his language to me, teaching the language to me, was fraught with the fear that I would suffer what he did, that I would be beaten, that I would be teased, that, I would suffer the losses that he suffered, and he just could not do it. Even as I got older and went to college in New Mexico and was really kind of desperate to learn the Tiwa language, he would say, it's going to have to be from someone else. And I would try to get him to talk about it, and he would say, it's just too much for me. I'm not a good speaker anymore. And you're just going to have to get it from someone else. We always went back to New Mexico for important times in my life, so that I was given my Indian names. You're given one when you're in Isleta. You're given one when you're born, one when you're about 12, and then one when you're about 18, when you're an adult. So if I were back at Isleta, most people would talk to me using the second name. That's the sort of more commonly used names. The other names are ceremonial. So I growing up, and particularly in my, late teens, early 20s, I was just filled with resentment and anger at my dad that he would not, give me this language that was sort of I felt the key to understanding myself as a Native person. Didn't grow up on the reservation. I knew where I came from because went back there all the time, but I didn't speak the language, and I came from a tribe that was very insular. So their view at the time was, if you don't speak the language, it's because your parents failed you. They didn't teach it to you. That's not our problem. That's your problem, and that's your parents' problem. And so there was no access to lessons and that sort of thing. When I moved into Washington and started learning about all these preservation efforts with the Lushootseed language and many Coast Salish language, I was blown away. And certainly when you get to the point where there's only 2 or 3 native speakers, and the language is going to die, that's really when people start to act to preserve those languages. And in our community, we have thousands of people who speak Tiwa, thousands of people who speak Karasun. Both Isleta and Laguna are very, I guess I should use the past tense, we're very reluctant to have any formalized program where they taught the language if you didn't get it at home. Part of that came from the experience of being exploited by anthropologists. One of the things that we do when we have ceremony, and so I can't talk about what happens in ceremony, but I can tell you this one piece. And that is, ceremony, sometimes it happens underground in the kivas, but sometimes it happens in a house because you need to clean the house of the spirit that was there before new people come in. And so that was one of my jobs, and it is seen as a job. It's an overnight experience. All these people come in. As I said, I can't describe what happened there. I'm not allowed to, but it was otherworldly. But the first thing we did was we took tea towels and covered all the windows in the house. And then a couple of people went outside the house and walked around to make sure, there wasn't a way to see in. And so I asked one of the people who was doing it, why do we do this? Because I really had no idea. And he said, we want to make sure the witches can't see. And I turned to my dad, and he said, he means anthropologists. So when my now 22-year-old son said he wanted to be an anthropologist, I was like, oh, kind of glad my dad's not around for that one, because the teasing would never end. So, my community, my community of Isleta, is, as I said, a very insular community. When I graduated from law school, my husband and I went back to Isleta, and we lived in the house that my father and my grandfather built. It was a small house on a piece of property that my grandfather farmed with my grandmother for most of their lives, and so my dad gave it to us to sort of start our adult lives. The way that many tribes track who owns what, you hear a lot of, tribes don't see property in the same way. And that myth really comes from practices throughout Native America that involve sharing, a sharing economy or a gifting economy. The economy works on exchange as opposed to money. I give you money or something of value, you give me the thing. Many tribal communities, and many in Alaska still work this way, worked on a giving economy. It's a completely different way of looking at survival. And so that was something, no, I sort of lost my train of thought there for a second. Yeah, okay. So at Isleta and Laguna, they had exchange that happened between them. Remember I talked about the trails, the running trails? So there were people that would run to share information about what was happening, but they were also running to exchange things. So, if Isleta had a good year with corn, someone would run with a basket on their back of something else, drop that off at Isleta, fill the basket with corn, run back to Laguna. It's a long way, by the way. Like, they're just casually running marathons, which I thought about the first time I ran a marathon, and I thought, I am not a great Indian. It's like, I would like to not do this, and I would like to not do this carrying 40 pounds of corn on my back. I just can't imagine. But in our community, it's an oral community. It's an oral culture. So when I went back to New Mexico, I did a clerkship with a Supreme Court justice in Santa Fe. So I would commute to Santa Fe every day. I did that for a couple of years. I practiced in private practice representing tribes for a little while. And then the chief judge of the Pueblo of Isleta, who was not an attorney, came to me and said, I have this case that involves a lawsuit against Burlington Northern. So there are train tracks that go directly through the Pueblo. And a young woman had been on the train tracks and was killed by a train. And the estate was suing Burlington Northern, and it was a huge personal injury claim. And he said, I don't have the legal knowledge to manage this case. Will you come in and do it? My justice, who continued to be one of my mentors until she passed away, said, you can certainly be a judge in your future, but you just need more time. You need more experience. It's not the time to do it. And my dad said, you can never be a judge for your own community. And so what did I do? I took the job. Some of you know me well enough already to say, okay, I see what's coming. So I didn't take the advice of the two people who gave me probably the best advice I'd ever gotten before or since. And it was true. It's very, very hard to be a judge. That one case became two cases became four. I started doing judicial work as much as I was doing my other work. At that point, I had moved into being a professor at the University of New Mexico Law School, and I was also a judge at Isleta. This part gets complicated, and I don't talk about it a lot, but I'm going to try to sort of explain this to you in a way that I hope will make sense. This picture sort of exemplifies the worst nightmare of my ancestors. My father living somewhere else, not on the reservation, marrying a white woman who was Jewish, not Christian, and, raising a child off the reservation. It accomplishes all the things that were in that first slide about federal policy. right? There's no way for me to do anything other than have English be my first language. I was born in Spain, but because my father was in the military, I was considered an American citizen. I will tell you that I am very anxious about my birth certificate if I ever get picked up by ICE, because my birth certificate doesn't look like any other birth certificate I've ever seen. It's Department of State birth certificate. And I've been told by a couple of lawyers, don't carry that, carry a copy of it. So that's a kind of a remarkable to me sort of statement. But when I think about that, I think about this picture because what my grandparents wanted, even though they sent my dad and his sister to sort of standard schools, is they wanted them to come back. And, you know, Mary Perry, my great-grandmother was lucky enough to be able to come back. But she wrote letters back to Colonel Pratt, copies of which we have, in which she expresses frustration at not being able to get the Laguna people to convert to Christianity and stop speaking the Karasan language. I mean, there's sort of a level of obsequiousness in the letters. They're really hard to read because they taught her to hate herself, and they were successful. And so when I look at this picture, you know, what I see is, you know, sort of the successful federal policies of assimilation. They taught my dad to be a soldier. He became a soldier. He met someone out in the world, and they had me. So, you know, some of you are familiar with the song Half Breed by Cher. I was growing up when that song was really popular, and, you know, people would yell it at me all the time. And it came from white people, but it also came from Isleta people. It was very confusing. So when I was born, my father enrolled me. That is to say, I became a citizen of the Pueblo of Isleta. He could have enrolled me in the Pueblo of Laguna, but because he grew up at Isleta, he felt more connection to Isleta, and believed that I should be a member of Isleta. And what that means is it gives me the right to vote. It gives me access to the Indian Health Service. It allows me to own property at Isleta. Any of the things that you think of when you think about citizenship are part of what you have when you're an enrolled citizen of a tribe. But tribes decide who is a citizen and who is not. And they have, at least right now, absolute authority to make those decisions. You can go to the next slide, Adrian. Thank you. This is a document that is called a Certificate of Indian Blood. They don't issue these anymore, which is a recent development. But the Department of the Interior would issue these to say this person has so much degree of so much blood. So basically blood quantum. She is wholly Laguna Pueblo. And then there's this adopted into the Isleta tribe. So what that reflects is that when my grandmother married my grandfather, she went through a very common traditional process of becoming adopted, and therefore from the purview of the community, the same as anyone who was born and enrolled at Isleta. She was considered an Isleta person by virtue not of this document, but by virtue of the traditional processes that were not written down that she went through. Go to the next slide. And this is a document that says, this was done in 1976. It's a Pueblo membership report, reflects the history that I just described. And it says, Mrs. Montoya has no assignment of land at Laguna Pueblo, will not consider requesting any in the future. I hereby certify that the above-mentioned person has relinquished membership in writing attached hereto in the Pueblo of Laguna. I further certify that she is to be given full consideration for tribal membership upon an adoption of a proper membership ordinance. What they're saying here is, in order for the white people, the federal government, to recognize this traditional process we've had millennia, going back and forth, marrying Isleta, Laguna, Laguna, Isleta, the federal government is going to require something in writing, an ordinance or a law, that says, this is what we do. This is how we consider, we decide who's a member and who isn't. And it is signed by the governor of the Pueblo of Isleta, as well as several people who were on the council at that time. So effectively what this document does is it promises my grandmother enrollment in the Pueblo of Isleta once there's a membership ordinance. So I was enrolled at Isleta when I was born. The requirements at Isleta were that you had to be 50%. You had to be half Isleta in order to be enrolled at Isleta. It was the highest requirement in the country. Not every tribe goes by blood. They sometimes do it by descendancy. There's 500 plus tribes, lots of ways you count who's who. But my tribe had this 50%. And you can imagine why, right? They're, as I said, very insular, very protective of the religious practices. They don't want that getting out. So if they extend it and say if you're a 16th, which is a more common enrollment blood quantum, then more people will have access to information and practices that this group of people didn't want. So a membership ordinance was never passed. It never happened. That is to say, a membership ordinance that talked about adoption. So I was enrolled as a 50%, Isleta. I have a certificate of Indian blood that shows that. It says that I'm half Isleta, so it says I'm half Isleta and half white. So let's come back to me being a judge at Isleta. Isleta is a very patriarchal culture. I know all these guys, and they weren't super psyched to see a young, law-trained woman as the judge. And I pretty uniformly got lectures about why I should not be sitting where I was sitting. Usually that we would start the proceedings and someone, one of the parties would start and say, I have to say something first. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Lente. And he would say, sometimes in English, sometimes in Tiwa, that I was shaming my family, that I shouldn't be there, that I had no right to judge him or his family, not just because I was a woman, but also because I wasn't really Isleta because I didn't speak the language. And it was interesting to be a judge in a place where I needed the interpreter. So I had an interpreter who would explain to me what was happening when the proceedings were all in Tiwa. And that happened fairly frequently because people were more comfortable speaking in Tiwa. And we did, I remember there was one property dispute between two very elderly people who were arguing about the width of the driveway. And one of them had put up an adobe wall, and the other one was like, you're on my property. And the way measurements are done for property like that, it involves the governor's canes, which I don't have a picture of. But the governor, that's what you'd call the chairman here. The governor is given these canes, and they've been passed down for millennia, governor to governor. And they're used for many things, but one of the things they're used for is measurement. So the width of the driveway wasn't 40 feet. It was a number of canes. And so, they're having this sort of ridiculous fight, probably because they were bored. And I was kind of like, well, let's go to the driveway and get the governor. So, I had a court reporter with her thing, follow me. And I had my court clerk, who was my interpreter, and we went to the site, and the governor came out and he said, this is how many canes it says it is on the plat, and you're over the line, so you got to take your wall down. And then he turned to me and said, right? And I would say, seems like that's probably right. So they didn't like me that much, but that was a very interesting experience. So at this point, when I had been a tribal court judge for Isleta probably about 3 years, and a massive political fight broke out. So you may recall me saying that there was a Bill of Rights that did not have in it that you could not establish a religion. The way Isleta works is there is a religious order. Those people who you do not name in English or in Tiwa, most people know who they are, those people make decisions about what happens at Isleta in closed doors in religious ceremonies. So they decide if you're going to open a casino. They decide who they're going to hire as the tribal judge. And then the elected body, that information is communicated to the elected body. So a lot of what happens in communities that run in this fashion, Isleta is not the only one, we're used to open government here in Washington. Actually, y'all are used to open government. It's still weird to me. I really have to think about it, because I sort of grew up understanding that that's what happened. There was this religious piece that happened. I was not a part of it. Very often when I was doing a case, I had to have someone come in and testify and explain what happened there in order to know what the law was, because much of the law wasn't written down. The actual written ordinances were about this thick, and they were about fireworks, the way that the cow ranges worked, so grazing, basically. There was a lot of stuff about grazing, and then there was a very thin criminal code. So everything else was like, okay, are we applying Isleta law here? New Mexico law, some combination of the book, because I'd have divorces that involved property and money, and it was, and they had a choice. They could go to the religious body to have it decided, or they could come to me. So if they came to me, they were saying, we want you to apply the law, whatever it is, you figure it out, to our divorce. And I had. There's actually an article I wrote called Whiteness in a Red Room that talks about this fight between a family where there was a husband cheated on wife, got the affair partner pregnant, and she had the baby, and the question was, what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with custody? Because wife didn't want nothing to do with affair partner, but there's a baby and the dad, and he wants to stay with the wife. So, how's that? I mean, they literally brought the baby into the courtroom for years. I watched that kid grow up for like 4 years. And they worked it out. It was incredible. They actually became this incredible little group around this kid after some time. The religious body, we're talking now about the year 2000, 2001. The religious body met right before an election for the council, banned this one person who was also a lawyer, and I agreed he was a pain, but they banned him from ever running for a seat on the council again, lifetime ban. Mostly because he was irritating. There wasn't like he did some terrible thing. So he sued those religious government people, the people you don't name. He sued them. He had them served. If whoever just made the low groaning noise is with me. And then he served all of the tribal council members who were elected, some of whom are on this. And Alvino Lucero, who was a councilman then, was the governor at the time. So he served all of them. What do you do when you get served and noticed to come to court? I guess you go to court. So the judge that hired me, who was a lay judge, an expert in tribal customs and traditions, said, well, I don't want to do this one by myself. And I happened to be in New York for some reason. I was gone. And there were two other judges. There was one full-time associate judge and another pro tem. And so the three of them sat en banc to hear the question of whether or not they had jurisdiction over this case. So it was a very preliminary hearing. Can we do anything about this? Because we didn't make the decision. This other body did. And they're not even supposed to be here. You can probably sue these people who are in a formal role, but we're not sure. That was basically what the three judges said. And so what they said was, the election is on Saturday. We're going to postpone it for a week and try to figure out the answer to that. That was a Thursday. The next day, the tribal council, the elected tribal council, fired all the judges. And then I came back to work on Monday. And so the judge that hired me called me and sort of explained what happened. And I didn't, it was like, what? He'd been the judge for years, like 40 years. He worked in terrible conditions because tribal courts have no funding. I mean, he worked miracles, and they just said, you're gone. So we mostly talked about that and didn't really talk about the case, but he said, you're the only judge, so I think you've got to go into the court on Monday because there's hearings. And then, you're going to have to figure out what to do about this. And I was like, well, what should I do? And he was like, well, the whole reason we stayed the election is because we don't know, so I don't know. Anyway, good night, have a nice evenings. It was literally the conversation. So I'm sorry, I'm just checking yeah. Okay, so I went to work the next day. I was asked to go to a meeting with the tribal council, which was Mr. Lucero, Mr. Jojola, and Mr. Lente were all there. And then there were two or three other people that had not signed that document, that were younger, new council members. This document was signed in 1976. And as I said, we're in the year 2000. Mr. Lente, Mr. Lucero, and Mr. Jojola knew my whole family, could tell me stories about my grandfather, et cetera, and my grandmother, for that matter. And so they sat me down and said, well, we have this problem. Could you help us for a while we figure out who's going to be our next chief judge? And could you sit as a chief judge for a period of time, maybe 4 or 5 weeks? And I said, well, we're coming up on a break at the law school. I think it'll work. I think I can do it. And he said, just one question before we appoint you to that. What are you going to do about this case? So I am speaking to parties, right? And I said, well, that would be an ex parte decision. That would mean I would be talking to you as a party, and I can't do that. I can't tell you. And he said, well, it's a violation of everything we believe. And so if you don't believe that, then you can't, there's nowhere you can sit as a judge. And I said, I didn't say I didn't believe it. I said, can't talk to you about how I would rule on it. And I sat there for about 3 hours being berated in English and in Tiwa. I had an interpreter. She told me all the bad words he said. Eventually they said, yeah, we don't want you to do it. Never mind. and you're fired too. And so I left, and I went home, and I said to my husband, because we were living on the reservation, and I said, we have to get out of here. We're going to be homeless. And he said, what are you talking about? And I told him the whole story, and he said, they're going to disenroll me, which means they're going to take my citizenship away. And within 3 months-ish, they did. And we were very lucky because I was in the process of job hunting at the time. And so I had got the job teaching at Western in Bellingham, like in that time frame. And so we had somewhere to go. And when I told my dad what was going on, he just roared with laughter. I was sobbing, right? Because I'm like, this community has never accepted me as an Isleta person. And now I have a piece of paper that says, we don't want you. This is excruciating. And he was like, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I was like, why are you laughing? And he was like, it all comes around. It'll come back around. Don't worry about it. This is just, another fight. We've been having these fights. It'll come around. And over time, as I've gotten older and reflected more and more on that conversation, I've realized in part that the language you speak constructs the way you think, particularly about time, right? So we're always talking about being on time, etc. There's many of you, I'm sure, have heard jokes about Indian time, which I'm a big proponent of, let me just say, okay? Let's go Indian time. His sense of justice, was like, it went back multiple generations. And he would always tell me, whatever you're doing is because those people made it, right? Those people survived. And that's why you're here. So the fact that you cry when I try to drill you with algebra problems is not touching my heart. Because, you're not getting beaten with a stick for speaking English. He had very little sympathy for the whining that he saw me doing around all kinds of stuff, including this, because his view was, sorry that you lost the land. You can give it back to me, you can give it to one of your cousins, you can sell it, you can do whatever you want, but I guess you can't live on it. And I felt totally, I've done a lot of therapy in my life, and I'm like, I think I feel abandoned. And, and I did. I felt like he just kind of checked out. The tribe was smart enough to not just disenroll me. And what they did was they adopted an ordinance that said anybody that has a document that looks like the one before this that says you're adopted into the tribe, those are null and void. We didn't write that, the Department of Interior did. We don't even know what that is. And so they disenrolled about 300 people, including all of my cousins, none of whom have ever spoken to me since, because it affected their children who were enrolled. And they all lived on the reservation, and then the next day they were told to get out because they were disenrolled. My first generation cousins were not, but all their kids were. And so they couldn't own any property, and they were over the age of 18. It was a huge nightmare. Over time, they started re-enrolling those people. And so by the time it was all said and done, it was my family and one other family. I don't even think I was that much of a troublemaker. The other guy was constantly troublemaking. And I had a friend say to me when, we were kind of going through all of this, he said, there's going to come a time where they're going to want to claim you. And you're going to have to decide whether or not you want that or not. So just think about that. And I was like, that's not what my dad meant. My dad meant 2 generations down the road. When 50% blood quantum is impossible, then they're going to open the doors back up. And he was like, no, that's going to happen sooner. So we moved to Washington. We had 2 wonderful children who somehow are now adults. It's very confusing. And you know, they grew up with a very tenuous connection to Isleta. Our older son is really rebuilding that pride in himself of being a Native person, and really understanding that stories like mine, of sort of being the product of successful federal intervention in my community, resulting in me living in urban environments and not back there and so forth. You know, you can track everything that has happened that has resulted in, you know, my existence, my kids' existence. The fact that I married someone who was non-native was a big deal for people when we lived on the reservation. You know, all of those things are things that are the direct result of decision makers in Washington about what to do about the Indian problem. Next slide. So that is why, when you read this second case that I wrote, that I started with a story. Many of you have read this case. It's about the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is something I've dedicated years and years to supporting. And when I was writing it, somebody said to me, you know, this is the first case about the Indian Child Welfare Act. For those of you that don't know what that is, it prevented the removal of children from their parents' care. If they were being abused or neglected, it set much higher standards for removal than if you were non-native, in order to ensure that communities could continue. And so someone said to me, I think it was actually Evany, my law clerk, said, I think this is the first case about ICWA written by an Indigenous person. As far as we can tell, that's true. And I thought, you know, I may never get the chance to write about ICWA again as a justice, and I'm going to tell our story, because we have ICWA, we have this federal law protecting our communities, because the prior 300 years have been the opposite of that, and that's why it matters. You can go to the next slide. So, can you stop him? They put me. Okay. You know, I tell this story and versions of it to lots of different groups, in part because I think it's really important to understand, when you're working on tribal issues or with tribal people, that the voice of the tribal community should be central to anything that we do. I mean, there's not all of you are lawyers in here, but many of us are. But also to recognize the long-term damage and trauma that has occurred, because it's not really historical. The trauma that I've experienced as a Native person, being a Native person, who comes from this history of removal. I am the first child in multiple generations to be raised by my parents. And I was raised by parents who were not raised by their parents. And their parents were not raised by their parents. So, you know, how do you know to be a good parent, right? Good question. So I'm going to end this with this TikTok. This is an artist from Canada who goes by the name Drives the Common Man. And he's a First Nation artist who does a lot of covers. And I asked him if I could use this in this talk. But this is basically him singing the story that I just told you. You can go ahead if you can get it to run.
In a residential school when I was 6 years old, forced me from my family and all I've ever known. I called out to my mama, but she could not hear me. I was 200 miles away in Shubenacadie. Tried to break my spirit, I wouldn't let them see me cry. They held my head under the water until I almost died. I can still hear screaming deep inside of me. I will always bear the scars from Shubenacadie.
I guess you can clap for Drives. He's the best. I don't know why he's not a World War star yet, but maybe he will be. Just next slide. So these are just a couple of pictures from the day I was sworn in. And I'm just going to wrap this up by saying that the feather that I'm wearing now is that feather, who was given to me by the Port Gamble slalom singers who attended my swearing in. And when I was walking up the steps to the Temple of Justice with Governor Inslee on the day he announced that he was appointing me, all I could think about was none of this was built with someone like me in mind. I think about it every day. It blows my mind that I'm here. Certainly when you look at the weight of history, it is extraordinary that Indigenous people are now starting to move in these circles. There's not tons of us. There's about 10 on state and federal benches. And yes, we have a group chat. But it's not on Signal. Sorry, that was really bad, and I'm probably going to get reported to the Commission on Judicial Conduct for saying that. But I couldn't resist it. It was good. It was just right there. So anytime I do something that's public, I really want to recognize the communities here, the Native communities here who have embraced me in extraordinary ways. About 8 years ago, I got a letter from the Pueblo of Isleta that said, if you want to come back and re-enroll, you may do so. And I did that. And I carry with me a card, a citizenship card that says that I'm a member of the Pueblo of Isleta. It was never a question because that is who I am. And as my husband said to me when I was really struggling with being rejected by my people, he said, those people don't decide who you are. You know who you are. So thank you for your attending today. If you have questions, I'm happy to take questions. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was if I've done any research about the surnames, because they're clearly not in the Karasan or the Tiwa language. I haven't done a ton of research, but mostly what happened is that when the conquistadors came through, they couldn't pronounce the names anywhere throughout the state of New Mexico, so they just gave people Spanish names. That's how Montoya came around, right? I haven't been able to find a lot of history about it. You can see the switch in the ledgers from like from Mary Perry was at one point in one of the census. It says Quiote, which was her name, and then it switches. And so I don't have a lot of history about it, but that's what I've been told. It's a good question. Yes. That's a great question. So Chad is asking about the Dawes Act, which is the Allotment Act. The Allotment Act was primarily aimed at the tribes in Oklahoma. And if you're interested in that, there's a couple of very recent wild cases about jurisdiction as a result of the way the allotments were done. Basically, the allotments were, every male head of household, native male head of household gets 10 acres. And, in fee simple. And then they didn't write wills. And they had 10 children. So then it would split into 10 and then it would split into 1,000, and then it's split into 10,000, and then there's 10 acres owned by 10,000 people. I'm not exaggerating. It creates innumerable problems. The Dawes Act never impacted tribes in New Mexico because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which guaranteed the land bases. So we've never had that issue. And when I moved to Washington for law school, I was like, what? I was completely blown away by the checkerboard of, I was like, wait a minute. Non-Indian people are living on the reservation. It still shocks me. And it raises all kinds of really interesting questions. And when I was a law professor, I thought they were a lot of fun, and my students did not think they were that great. But no, in New Mexico, we didn't have that particular jurisdictional problem. Any other questions? Laura? So the question is, can I say more about Felix Cohen's book on Indian law? As I said, it is considered the treatise. I can't say that it's wrong, right? I mean, he's right about, or when it was originally written by him, it was the state of Indian law. And the state of Indian law was to say that Native people communities are quasi-sovereign, never really defined that, which has created all these other problems. I think he accurately described what was happening. What I think he didn't do, and I actually met him before he died. He was very old. But he had been, a tremendous supporter of Indigenous law students. And when I met him, I had been given that book, maybe 6 months before I met him, or a year. And when I read it, I thought, this guy's the architect of this. I mean, obviously not the stuff that happened in 1750. He wasn't that old. But he was the architect of much of it. He was the flip side of John Collier. John Collier was in the federal government doing the things to make tribal people assimilate. Felix Cohen was saying, this is the legal framework in which you can do it. So what he could have done, and we say this all the time in when we practice Indian law, is like, it could be worse, right? They could have said, no, there's no sovereignty, and that would have been that. And so, he said things about protecting treaty rights and, ensuring that tribes have, maintain a certain degree of sovereignty. And so I can't say that that's necessarily bad, but it is, I think, paradoxical. And I don't think we really talk about that. So that book was just rewritten, as I said, by a bunch of Indigenous professors who did, well, they weren't all Indigenous, but they all had different chapters that they rewrote. And I think it's a better book than it was. But I'd like somebody to write about that tension. I'm not going to do it, but nice if somebody did. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very good question. So the question was, going back to the Allotment Act and the period of assimilation and the Indian Reorganization Act, all of those federal laws had aspects of them that banned traditional tribal practices. Like they specifically said, no potlatches, which is something that the tribes up here do. That's not allowed. They banned certain dances in the Sioux tribes. There was also part of the, I think it was in the Indian Reorganization Act, where they said, that there's a ban on any religious dancing, which is wild to me. It's like, it's like Footloose. You got to move. So, but my community dancing is an integral part of who you are. So, when I see an eagle fly over me, I picture my dad, and if you want to come into my chambers, it's one of the first things you'll see in his eagle costume. It's just part of who we are as, going to other communities' dances. So the band wasn't successful, but there are many, many things like that. And the Sioux continued the ghost dance against the prohibition of the federal government, and Custer went in and mowed them down in the middle of the ghost dance. So when it restarted, I think the first, I think the first ceremonial ghost dance was in the 70s. It was a very big deal. And it came out of the American Indian movement that they were saying, we're taking this back. You can't stop us from doing this. So, there are hundreds of examples of it, actually, of things that you sort of weren't allowed to do based on federal law. My experience has been that all that stuff happened anyway. It just went underground. In my tribe, it literally went underground because much of what we do is in a kiva that is dug out underground, and you don't know what happens there unless you're invited to go in. And if you're invited to go in, you don't tell anybody what you saw or did. And the covering the windows to protect against the anthropologists is another example of that. I think that there are all kinds of stories from all over the country of the strength of indigenous communities in resisting. I guess it's because I'm a Sleta that I think Sleta is the most bestest. But there's all these stories of, the Catholic Church that is on our reservation. When the priest started trying to interfere with what was happening at the indigenous religious stuff, they literally lined up, grabbed him arm in arm, and walked him off the reservation and said, never come back. So, there's many examples of that just from my community alone that I'm aware of. Yeah.
You talked about land in New Mexico and
Mm-hmm.
tribal courts authority over land. What about water? The other critical piece.
Rob, don't ask me about water law. It's okay. So when I went to law school, I had no idea what I was going to do. You've heard me talk about this, I'm sure, but I'd never met a lawyer. I didn't know what a case was. I had very naive ideas about what I could do once I was a lawyer, and everyone assumed that I was going to practice Indian law. That was just the assumption. You're going to go back to New Mexico and represent your people, right? That wasn't my plan. I mean, I did do it, but it wasn't my plan. There was intense pressure to do it, though. And there was intense pressure to practice water law. And I looked at my firm, which represented tribes from all over the country, and the two lawyers that were doing water law, who were in their 50s-ish, were working on the same case they started on when they started practicing. And I was like, no thank you to that. And they loved it, more power to them. But I was like, oh no, that's terrible. So I truly tried to avoid it. I've been somewhat unsuccessful, but I don't know a whole lot about it, except to say that when you're asking a jurisdictional question, where do those cases belong? What I do know is that the state thinks those cases belong in the state courts. The tribes think they belong in the tribal courts, and the federal government thinks it belongs in the federal courts. And many of those cases are just that fight. They have not even gotten to who gets how much. I know Justice Stevens is, Chief Justice Stevens is at a water law conference right now, and they're working on setting up a water adjudication court in Whatcom County in Bellingham. The tribes are participating Lummi and Nooksack have agreed to participate and allow it to happen in state court. I predict that when there is a decision that is that the tribes don't agree with, they're going to remove it to federal court. So I don't think there's a very good answer. I think it's a mess. Do we have time for maybe one more question? Yeah. There are written like stories about that have been written down. There are a couple that are in a library in, I think in Pine Ridge, I want to say, but somebody who I used to do a lot of presentations with, who was also a Native judge, had seen them and talked to family members who would tell them the stories and stuff. So, I think that they're not apocryphal. I think there's probably really true examples of it. It's hard to know. But yes, there are a couple that I've heard were documented in some way. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, given, sort of where we started talking about Pratt's views on education, and I grew up in a family that was very pro-education and, now educated, some would say overeducated. And so the question is, how do I feel about it now? I'm very conflicted. Some of you may be familiar with Vine Deloria, who wrote a lot of books. Custer Died for Your Sins is probably the one that he's most famous for. He wrote a lot of books where he was saying, if Indians keep going to white schools, then we might as well just give up the fight right now. His brother, Sam Deloria, who has been my mentor for like almost 40 years, the two of them disagreed on that to the extent they didn't speak to each other for years, because Sam was like, look, we can talk about how terrible it was, but we can use it to our advantage. He went to Yale Law School, and he started a program in New Mexico that is the reason why we have the numbers of indigenous lawyers we have. We need lots more, but many of us go through a program that is in New Mexico specifically for Native students who are about to head to law school. I went to that program in 1992. It's called the Pre-Law Summer Institute. It was the first time I had been in a room where everyone was Native. And it completely changed my life. It was only 8 weeks long. I got married in the middle of it. Don't recommend that. It's like, this super intensive program where they try to kind of replicate the first semester of law school in 8 weeks. But, Sam would say to us as a group, and he brought in speakers who were indigenous lawyers and had been practicing a long time. And he would say, if you can use the words of the white man against them and be successful, then that's what we should be doing, because we're just taking those tools and we're using them to our advantage, and that's a possibility, and that's what we should be doing. But to say that indigenous people should just not be educated because our history is terrible, sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's some wisdom there, and I'm very grateful for the education that I've been able to access. That said, when I said that the process of education in these boarding schools was violent, my experience of education from the time I started going to school was violent. Whether that came from teachers or other students, whether that was about racism or sexism or just bullies because I was small, or whether that was because I was unlearning what I was taught at home, it was an excruciating experience all the way up through law school and graduate school. It was painful and it did damage. And I think that's something we don't talk about much. And so that's something that, every Native student I've spoken to in my entire career bears the scars of. I think we're starting to see more Indigenous representation in documentaries and films, and we're starting to see stories about the residential schools. And it's great to be represented, and there's currently on Netflix a half-hour sitcom called North of North that is about an Indigenous community in the Arctic. And, I was watching it over the weekend thinking, I could not have even conceptualized that could exist, even 10 years ago, much less as a child. It made me cry just because I was like, those people look like me. And my experience in schools was that if I spoke up, I was always speaking for Indian people, not just for myself. Or if I was in a room where there were other Native people, which this happened at the University of Mexico a couple of times, people would say, you didn't grow up on the reservation, you have no voice here, you're a half-breed. It really is just sort of this complex morass of mixed feelings. I think that the thing we don't talk about very much when we talk about school is that it is one model that we apply to everyone. And that model is not, what else do we do that is that one model that should apply to everyone? There's not a whole lot of examples of that. So it's going to do damage. It's going to do damage to neurodivergent people who are struggling to be successful in an environment where they're told to stop tapping their foot because it's annoying to the teacher, and that's a way they can get energy out. I just think we have a long way to go to have any kind of system that is a welcoming one. I say that, and then I hear my dad in my head, like, well, at least you didn't get the ass kicked out of you every day. I didn't. It was better than that. Not very much. So, I have very mixed feelings. I think the more educated I've become, the further away I've moved from my community. And I think that's really painful. Well, thank you all for spending this beautiful spring afternoon with me. Thanks for coming. And special thanks to my extern, Abrian, back there for running my computer. I really, really appreciate you doing that.